Thanks so much for having me here. So glad to be here with you and with everyone who's on our webinar this morning. Just to introduce Chicago Beyond, we are an impact investor who's focused on backing the fight for equity. And we ourselves have also run open calls for transformative funding through what we've called our Youth Equity Challenge. And before receiving our applications and even afterward, our judges went through a deliberate process. And what I'm going to talk through here today are some of those practices that we introduced really as part of our own process to ensure that we were checking ourselves on what we might be seeing or not be seeing or the value or meaning that we were giving to certain things. So a couple of questions that come up. One is when it comes to making a decision about who to fund, don't we want each judge to bring their individual perspective to that decision? And the answer to that is absolutely. But the question really is, what of our perspective are we intending to bring, and what serves in making a good decision for investing in the work with transformative impact versus what we're unconsciously bringing that might inadvertently cut against making a difference on a significant problem of our time. Let me give you a couple quick examples on how that can show up. One is just beauty bias. And in our culture, we associate beauty with success. And so there's physical beauty, but it also shows up for us in writing style, in grammar, and in spelling. And so as a judge, I might subconsciously react to how, let's say, for example, the first paragraph of an application is written. And from that, I might say that maybe that team cannot execute. And I might giving higher scores to an organization that submits an application that has really excellent grammar, really excellent use of the English language, which at the end of the day might not be the best proxy for ability to think and do differently on a significant problem of our time.
And Liz, could I just add something there?
Sure.
I think this is particularly important given that this is a global competition. We've asked for applications to be in English, but for not everyone is English going to be the first language. So please be patient and try to read through what may not be perfect.
Exactly, and it's getting clear that the point is not that a truly transformative application or a truly community-led application will either have exquisite grammar or patchy grammar, but the point here is just to be aware of the assumptions of what we connect to impact and durability, that unconscious bias that we bring. The second I'll raise today is just affinity bias. And that's when something reminds us of something that we know and that we like. And it's just inherent in who we are as human beings. We bring this greater sense of warmth, we pay more attention. And this can also work in the opposite way when there's something that we're reminded of that we dislike. So as a judge, let's say I, for example, am really particular around childhood focus. So I might unconsciously rate an application that had a focus on early childhood higher than something else. As a judge, I might have an affinity, as a judge, I might subconsciously have an affinity basis or bias for science-based applications, for larger scale quantitative evidence, causing me to unintentionally disfavor applications or applicants who have a lot of experience working with harder to serve communities and harder to reach populations. So I'm assessing that application. It's really my responsibility just to be conscious of that particular bias. It's just a fact, like we all have bias, right? Neuroscience shows it's built into our human brains, it's how we function. We couldn't get out of bed in the morning if we had to evaluate every single decision that we had to make, and we're constantly reevaluating everything every single day. But when we're trying to invest in work that's truly ambitious, as is 100 and change, then it's important that we make sure that we're being conscious of that bias, because it could get in the way of how we look and how we assess different applications. So let me share just a couple more examples of bias to be aware of. The next is just this halo bias. And it's when we see one really great thing in an application, and because of that, we let that halo glow of that effect, of that opinion, affect really everything else in the application. But it can also work in the opposite way. Think of that halo almost as having horns as well. So as a judge, I might see evidence from a certain university, and I might subconsciously conclude that the application is more evidence-based. But only certain types of work have access to university researchers. Only certain types of work connect to data in big administrative databases. And vulnerable populations are less likely to be able to fully be counted in data sets because of how the production of evidence works. There's also the all too familiar confirmation bias, and that's when we subconsciously we look for things that back up our own opinions. And it's our desire to conform with a group that we are part of. And the last I'll mention today is just contrast bias. It's when we compare something that we see in an application to another organization or another context that we know, subconsciously defining a comparison point that may not be appropriate. So for example, a judge might subconsciously be evaluating how impactful an application led by smaller, multiple community-based organizations, how that compares to a larger institution's ability to articulate its impact in an entirely different context. And the point here is really just by pausing and bringing that implicit judgment into my conscious focus, I can evaluate where the comparison is appropriate or whether I'm unintentionally judging things that look different than what I've seen before to be less feasible or less durable.